Welcome back. You're listening to the panel discussion, The Future of Network Infrastructure, Secure, Software-Defined, and Automated, sponsored by Leidos on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guests today, Stephen Rice, the Deputy CIO at the Homeland Security Department, Beth Cloran, the Deputy CIO at the General Services Administration, Ira Barron, the Chief Technology Officer at the Office of Justice Programs in the Justice Department, and Angie Heisey, the President of the Civil Group at Leidos. At the end of the last segment, we just finished talking about kind of where everyone is at. And Angie, you brought up this idea of cyber automation and prepare for the future. And in many ways, this network infrastructure modernization effort is doing all three. And it kind of fits in that short-term, long-term, but really it's all about foundational. So maybe Ira, jump in about what you guys are doing at OJP and more generally at Justice Department about how your efforts are both, impacting short-term and some long-term efforts.
So as we discussed previously, we've got this sort of moving model with our network diminishing to a certain degree, the JMD network changing, or excuse me, the JMD network changing that we piggyback on as we're tenants on it, and then our relationship to the cloud continues to evolve. As part of the strategy, we're looking for more software as a service, platform as a service, and trying to limit how much infrastructure as a service we end up leveraging. The reason being, of course, we want to buy services and not have to build those services and do all the maintenance to them. So for us, the impact in terms of our network architecture and strategy is that we need to engage new stakeholders, the cloud service providers, the application providers on top of that, in some cases find applications that we want, and then a cloud service provider in a FedRAMP space that can get to ATO for us. So there are new players involved that we hadn't experienced before. And in some ways we have to foster a multi-dimensional relationship. JMD, OJP, a cloud service provider, and an application vendor.
And it's also, I'm going to jump in real quick, because it's also on the other end, the mission side, because where the mission could just say, okay, I'm going to throw it up on the network. Now it's like, wait a minute, where does that make sense for you to put it? Whether it's the cloud, the public cloud, the private cloud, or internal. I mean, that's the other piece of this too.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we have to think carefully about how the public will get access to the resources and how our internal staff will get to the resources as well, which introduces, in some cases, additional complexities to our network architecture because we have a path for the public, we have an alternative path for internal users. Authentication is different. Identity management is different. There's an interesting challenge that we're facing now in terms of impact on our users, in that we're trying to move toward a more modern experience in terms of identity management, and importantly, the enrollment of individuals and organizations with whom we do business. Historically, our system administrators, application owners, and service desk we're busy all the time resetting passwords, establishing accounts, and then changing the privileges that users had under authority from people who asserted they had authority in these organizations to tell us what to do. We would like to get out of that business. And it means moving more toward modern models for how organizations manage enrollment, how individuals are invited in to become members of those organizations. And we've been having internal discussions about the impact on the public. And it's quite curious, I think, because on the one hand, we're trying to present a model that should be very familiar to them. On the other hand, we're radically changing the way they interact with our government systems. And therefore, we have to be sensitive to change management, messaging, and in some cases, run it up the flagpole to make sure that executives within Department of Justice and elsewhere are comfortable with those sorts of changes.
Angie?
Yeah, so I think Ira is spot on relative to it's becoming such a user-centric, or you can even say mission-centric, or if it's a public-facing service, public-centric citizen services, where the conversation is changing. So when you're looking at roadmaps, whether it be technology, not only does it have to be across all the different functions, whether it be network and cloud and applications, but it really has to take into consideration how those end users use those services on a daily basis and how much they rely on them, whether it be a citizen or it be a government employee who is trying to, complete their mission, or it'd be inside of an organization where productivity is absolutely reliant on this technology. And so, in my opinion, it's an exciting time for CIOs to be able to have those conversations across the entire enterprise to figure out how we can best provide those services in a way that, quite honestly, should make all of our lives easier.
And this relates back to something that Beth said, I think, earlier about understanding the user needs and ensuring that there's, when you have certain surges and certain downplays, how is GSA trying to add, because your user base potentially could grow quite a bit.
Yes. If you heard the announcement last week, yes, we expect that our population will grow as we start getting into the HR transactions world. And with that, I mean, what we really have to think about is to Angie's point, is how is that customer sitting in the middle, right? And then we build technology around it. Before we would say, it was by program, and we do it program by program by program and build these tiny little silos of technology. But what we find now is it's an ecosystem, and people do not, especially citizens or even our employees, don't have a one and done experience with their government. It's an ecosystem. I mean, think about it. In some way, shape, or form, the federal government is present in the lives of Americans from birth to death. And we have to understand and be proactive about those engagements, both internally as federal providers and good stewards of the taxpayer dollars, but also to the citizens by which pay the taxes that we actually use. And so we have to look, and so in GSA, we're really looking at all of those different elements and sequences and figuring out how to be the best organization we can to provide those blueprints, those roadmaps and things, not only for our agency, but for other federal agencies to use, which is why, I think things such as the Centers of Excellence and having 18 out there is really important, so that we can actually take some of the best practices that have been developed at GSA and be able to populate those across the government. But internally, what we're really trying to look at is how do we always make sure that our GSA IT organization is looking outward, and what is that customer experience? We also want to make sure that, how are we building our internal organizations, our development teams? I heard DevSecOps. We are really moving forward. All of our organizations have DevSecOps, because you need to make sure that you're coupling that agile success that we have had and demonstrated under FITARA, but move it to that next level, which means we need to be having the right people technology-wise and business-wise throughout the ecosystem as we build these systems. And then we also need to make sure we're really having the right performance metrics and service levels, so we understand when we're delivering capability, did it truly make the mark, right? And if not, then what do we need to do to come back and validate what was successful, learn from those, and be able to be more successful on the next. I think the other thing too is and I understand we're in a posture of having a very risk-adverse thing because of having some cyber issues in the past, but being able to be insular, and GSA does this really well, of being successful quickly and saying, yes, that worked or it didn't work, and then being able to say, we're not going to invest in this and we're going to invest over here, and making sure that we build those capabilities in from the front is really successful. And then you just need to make sure that both from your hosting capability and from your network, those are your foundational services. You think of the house, you got to build it on a solid foundation, but it's got to also be incremental. We used to build everything with brick and mortar, and so when we wanted to try to shift, it was very difficult. We also now have to think of infrastructure more as Lego bricks, right? You got to be able to pull them out, put them back in as the technology is changing. We know that the next level of technology that we're going to looking at beyond what we've done with the cloud is going to be around not just RPA, but artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things. But that's just what we know is coming. Technology is changing so quickly. There's going to be another thing in 2 years from now we don't even know, but we all want to do, and be able to shift to it quickly. So we need to build these foundations now and make sure that we're having those right conversations and building the right architecture so that we can do the more plug and play in the future.
Steve, jump in here, because when Beth talks about building those foundations, the Lego bricks, that's something that DHS is trying to do. When I remember reading the RFI for the managed services you guys are looking at and changing the model of your network, that's really the key here and it goes back to our favorite topic, enterprise architecture. So we don't want to bore too many people, but it is a hot topic again.
This is a fascinating conversation, Jason. When you start talking, we've talked ecosystems, we've talked roadmaps, and what's interesting, These are layers of ecosystems and layers of roadmaps. We touched on identity management. What does the identity management look like for the roadmap over the next 5 years in my world across government? We start talking about the network roadmap across how we're going to transport data securely. You start talking about compute and storage and the cloud edge. We've also talked about security monitoring. But at the end of the day, is when we start talking about this, it's just really changing the conversation internal to large organizations, because you're bringing the application development, application hosting team, you're bringing compute storage, you're bringing your security team together, you're bringing your leadership, procurement, and finance together to understand this is a very complex transition. They call it transition, modernization, journey to the cloud, whatever you want to refer to it as. This is a multidisciplinary action that's taking place. And in my world, we always take into consideration the mission, and also to include the seasonality of missions. So in the world is, how are we defining a modern network to compute across the nation in some very austere locations that allows me to bring down latency to the application edge, so that my mission, whatever that area happens to be, can get to the timely data necessary. And additionally, what does that look like over the next 3 to 5 to 7 years? And what's happening is we're around the table, rolling up the sleeve, trying to define those requirements, knowing new technologies are coming. So what's so fascinating is, this is the journey I know we are immersed in DHS, but I'm fascinated to see how it's taking place at Leidos, GSA, and Justice, because it's great that we're all coming together, looking at it a little bit differently, but also understanding that these layers exist that we're trying to noodle through.
Beth?
So I think the other part of this too is we also have to understand how people are interacting with technology, and where they're interacting is changing, right? We are becoming a more mobile workforce. I mean, when I was putting in laptops 3 or 4 years ago, I was like, ooh, a laptop. Then I was like, yeah, a tablet. Now it's like, can I just do it on my phone, right? I mean, it's so we have to understand, as we're doing this evolution, to Steve's point, is we have to have the foundation of making sure we're doing our mission, but we also have to understand the method and mechanism that we are doing this in is changing and evolving. And so we need to be proactive on how we're doing it, so that we can deliver it in the mechanism that is best used for our employees and for our citizens, but making sure that we're doing that with the right privacy and security wrapper from the get-go.
Angie, jump in.
So I love the analogy around Lego blocks, and I think there's a lot of implications around it. And one of them that I believe every organization, every customer I work with, is how do you take the skill sets that we've used historically to build the brick and mortar, right, to now shift them so that they do think about things in Lego bricks, and problem solving, and being creative, and being agile, and how do we create those cultures and those teams to be able to adjust? Because, like Beth said, there's so many technologies that are going to be coming out, probably even the next 3 to 5 years, that we don't anticipate, that we are trying to set up, that we can actually adjust and then deliver here in the next couple of years.
And I think you took us down a path of skill sets and stuff. So let's hold up on that. Let's put a pin in that for a second, because I think the other piece of this, and maybe goes back to what Ira was saying to lead us off, is as agencies are heading down this path, and the different paths are heading down, it all kind of converges back at that data center piece. And what does the data center look like in the future? How is consolidation, optimization? So from as you guys have had to make decisions about what stays, what goes, what can go to the public cloud, what goes to our private cloud, talk a little bit about how the network piece is the, if you will, the data centers and the networks are kind of underpinning each other for the broader support of the mission area.
Well, that's a great question. And I'm going to have to reach to conjecture on some of this, since much of it is happening at the Department of Justice level in terms of how the network architecture is changing among the data centers.
Well, let me put a finer point on it, because as you guys at OJP are kind of making decisions about applications, you have to decide, okay, which network is the best network for me or for us. And maybe that would help you, so you don't have to conject so much.
Perfect, good. So if this is really about mapping workload to the right destination, that helps me. That's great, thank you.
Well, we'll make it there for you.
Excellent. So some of it was driven by who is the vendor that provides this, and frankly, there are certain services that come from known vendors who have known cloud offerings. So therefore, there's a natural affinity to go with their product in their cloud-hosted environment. I won't use brand names at the moment. So in some ways, that makes it easy, right? Go with the people who know it best and can support it best. And certainly with a lot of our productivity applications, there are great choices for where you host your email and your document storage and all of that. When it comes down to vendor products that we want to install in a cloud environment, it becomes a little more complex because we have to ask ourselves, well, what's the affinity to the operating system? What's the affinity to the database technology? How much would we want to recast this to use other sorts of services that may be available in a cloud environment for scalable databases or database as a service versus an installed database that we would have to maintain? So we go through that sort of math, and even with some of the applications that we've lifted and shifted in that were built on behalf of Office of Justice programs under our grants, we have taken the opportunity to speak to the architects and ask whether we can refactor in certain ways that can take more advantage of native services in the cloud environments. And that helps us as well, because if there's, again, an affinity to one flavor of a cloud-based service versus another, it's easier for us to map there. Interestingly, and this is only recent, we've been finding that some of the vendors who have built systems on behalf of Office of Justice program that we now have to bring in are themselves starting to take advantage of native cloud services, which is fascinating and excellent in large part because it really brings the resiliency, redundancy, and performance that we want. And we don't have to build it, which is great because somebody else built it for us. But in that case, if they have built it to use specific services within a certain cloud environment, the choice is really obvious for us.
And that's where the software as a service piece comes in. I think one of you all mentioned earlier that we want to get away from the infrastructure and stick with software and platform. On that note, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we can continue our conversation. You're listening to the panel discussion, The Future of Network Infrastructure, Secure, Software Defined, and Automated, sponsored by Leidos on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network.